For the longest time, video games have been able to bring to life some of our most beloved and cherished characters, one of which I would argue is universally accepted by all. It doesn't matter how old you are, what your gender is, or whether you eat your cereal with milk or water. I'm about to show you something that is impossible to hate. Well, am I right? I'd also bet that even if you've never played any of this little guy's games, you know exactly who this is. And yes, that may be because you read the title of this video, but that's besides the point. Over the past 3 decades, Kirby has become one of Nintendo's most recognizable characters. The Kirby franchise in particular has become one of the most consistent series not just in Nintendo's library, but in all of gaming, spanning well over 30 games as of the current day. But how did Kirby manage to get to this stage? How did what is essentially a pink blob become one of gaming's most adored characters? And how has the franchise managed to stay on top all these years when so many others have failed? Today, we'll look to recount that story, all while we witness the unwavering rise of Kirby. Now, if you've never heard of Kirby, you'd take one look at him and think he was some drawing done by a little kid, but the little puffball's origin is far more interesting than that. 1992 was far from a family-friendly year for gaming. Games like Mortal Kombat, Wolfenstein 3D, and Night Trap had parents and politicians up in arms over the possibility of their children becoming Satan. But this year also saw the birth of one of the most wholesome characters to ever exist. Following the monumental success of their flagship platformer Mario, Nintendo looked to branch out to other avenues and tasked HAL Laboratory, a close partner of theirs, to develop a new game for the Game Boy. This task fell to a young Masahiro Sakurai, who wanted to develop a game that was simple enough for even beginners to get into. At the time, the team hadn't conceptualized a formal character, and instead created a placeholder character, a simple pink blob with a cheerful smile. This character was originally known as Po Po Po, and looked to star in his own game called, well, Po 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 of the Spring Breeze. Nintendo wanted to appeal to a more worldwide audience, however, and would create a poll for name suggestions, including names such as Gasper and Kirby. Shigeru Miyamoto has stated that the name Kirby was to some degree inspired by John Kirby, the attorney that had previously defended Nintendo in its huge case against Universal City Studios over their King Kong/Donkey Kong disputes. He'd also gone to say that Kirby was ultimately chosen as the Japanese norm at the time was to give cute characters very soft names with soft sounds, whereas Kirby had a harsh sound to it. It was this juxtaposition that Miyamoto found hilarious, and as a result, a new character was born. Kirby would make his first appearance on his own game titled Kirby's Dreamland, released in 1992 for the Game Boy. A side-scrolling platform, as we discussed, the game was developed with beginners in mind, and as such is incredibly easy, with Kirby being able to hover indefinitely in the air, while also being fairly tough, allowing for multiple hits to be taken before being defeated. This game would also introduce players to his now iconic inhale ability, where he could suck in enemies and then spit them out and feed others. Funnily enough, Sakurai had originally planned for Kirby to use his tongue to grab opponents, but this was later changed to inhaling. Despite the game being relatively easy, it would also feature a mode that has become synonymous with the rest of the series, known as Extra Mode, or Extra Game. This was a hidden mode that increased the difficulty by allowing players to play against tougher enemies that would deal more damage. Now I'm sure you must have been wondering, why is Kirby white on the cover? Or maybe you didn't even realize it. But the reasoning for this is actually not that well known, and is merely considered a mix-up between Nintendo and the localization team. Without them knowing the actual color of the character, the localization team most likely went with white, as it was how Kirby appeared while on the Game Boy. The game would go on to become a commercial success, selling more than 1 million units worldwide within a year, and overall would sell over 5 million copies, placing it among the best-selling games in the whole franchise. It would also mark the beginning of what would one day become one of Nintendo's most prolific franchises. Following the success of Dreamland, Kirby would return barely a year later, now on a home console, in his second game, Kirby's Adventure for the NES. This game would expand greatly on the initial concepts laid out, and would be the first time copy abilities were made available. Now, instead of merely sucking in enemies and spitting them back out, Kirby would gain abilities based on the enemies he sucked up. These ranged from having a sword to elemental powers such as spark or stone. This allowed for an incredible amount of replayability, as any level could now be played using any ability, meaning every playthrough would be unique. The game would also be the first to break up levels into distinct stages, including big switches, minigames, and the ability to slide, use the water gun, and dash. To say this game improved on all aspects of its predecessor would be an understatement. The sales, unfortunately, wouldn't live up to the predecessor, as the game saw a sharp dip with only 1.75 million units sold. This decrease wouldn't do anything to stop the drive of Kirby though, and within the next 2 years, the little puffball would have his own series of spin-off games in the form of Kirby's Pinball Land, Kirby's Dream Course, and Kirby's Avalanche. While Pinball Land was based off, well, pinball, and Dream Course off golf, Kirby's Avalanche was interesting, as it has remained the only game to never see a Japanese release. This was because the game itself was based off the popular Japanese puzzle game Super Puyo Puyo, except this time Kirby characters had taken over. For the most part, these games were received well, and while not selling billions of copies, provided consistent content for the growing fanbase. Kirby would return with a sequel to the original Dreamland called, Dreamland 2 in 1995, also for the Game Boy. If you didn't think Kirby was adorable enough on his own, then the cuteness overload from this game would certainly supply that dopamine hit. Meet Rick the hamster, Coo the owl, and Kind the sunfish. These adorable little sidekicks were able to use Kirby's copy abilities in new and unique ways, with each combination of Kirby and friend resulting in different powers. The game sold far more than Kirby's Adventure, giving birth to the idea that the franchise was once again on the rise. The franchise would see another spin-off released at the end of 1995 in Kirby's Block Ball. This meant that in 1995 alone, the Kirby franchise had seen 3 new releases. While 2 of them may have been spin-offs, this was still a truly remarkable feat, especially for a franchise that was as fresh and new as Kirby. This momentum wouldn't slow down either, as within the next year, one of the most influential games in the franchise would be released. That game was Kirby Superstar. Released for the SNES in 1996, this game is often regarded as one of the most important in the entire series. The game itself strayed away from the usual format of a linear storyline, and instead consisted of 6 main games, each with differing storylines and various other sub-modes. The idea of Kirby wearing different hats relating to the ability he had copied was also first introduced in Superstar, and many of the series' most iconic characters such as Dynablade, Chef Kawasaki, and Marx would first appear in this game. Were you fighting with your sibling over who gets the next turn on the console? Well, no worries, because in Superstar you can now play it together. Well, kinda. The game has become one of the most beloved among fans, and its legacy has defined many of the series' most endearing tropes. By now, the Kirby franchise had released 8 total games over its 5-year span, which compared to any other franchise's release cycle was very impressive to say the least. The games were simple, easy to get into, and brought a level of wholesomeness not present at the time. Going into 1997, Kirby would see a further 2 releases, in Kirby Star Stacker, a falling block puzzle game, as well as another return to the Dreamland series, in Kirby Dreamland 3. These games, while accepted, weren't considered anything special, with many feeling they were a step down from the surprise banger that was Superstar. Following this, the Kirby franchise would go without a new entry for the next 3 years. And while this was a first for the adorable pink blob that had seen a game released every year since its inception, there was a very specific reason for this. At the time, HAL Laboratory and Sakurai in particular were busy developing their very own fighting game. Featuring the many star characters in Nintendo's biggest franchises, the game would be unveiled in 1999 as Super Smash Bros. Of course, a game developed by HAL and Sakurai himself had to feature the adorable pink blob. Not only this, but he was actually pretty damn good. If you hadn't heard about Kirby yet, then this game would definitely be the eye-opener, as Super Smash Bros. Would go on to receive critical acclaim and sell well over 5 million units. Now, after decking the rest of Nintendo's library in Smash Bros., Kirby would return to his own franchise, but this time in 3D. Released in 2000 for the N64, and taking after the majority of other titles on the platform, we have the fittingly titled Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards. Now I say the game was 3D, but that wasn't exactly the case. Kirby himself was viewed from a 2.5D perspective, which the environment appeared 3D, but Kirby himself actually controlled exactly how he would in previous games on 2D platforming segments. The game would also introduce power combos, which fused 2 different copy abilities to make an entirely new attack. The game for the most part was deemed a respectable return to the franchise. Another set of spin-off games were released with Kirby Tilt and Tumble, the first to introduce motion sensor-based games that had the players tilting their Game Boy colors to move Kirby. Or if you were a beast, or as a normal person would call them, speedrunner, you'd use the whole GameCube as a motion controller? What the f? Speaking of GameCube, Kirby Air Ride, a Kirby-themed racer, would make itself known as the only Kirby game present on the system in 2003. An enhanced remake of Kirby's Adventure would release late into 2002 titled Kirby Nightmare Dreamland. And at the same time as all this, Kirby would star in his own anime, simply titled Hoshi no Kirby, which premiered in Japan towards the end of 2001. And if that wasn't enough for you, if you hadn't had enough Kirby yet, he would also appear in the next Smash Bros. Game, where he remained one of the top tiers. Now, while this continuous onslaught of Kirby games was healthy for the franchise, it would certainly start to take its toll on the developers that were pumping out the games. And by the end of 2003, it had proved too much for Sakurai. Following Kirby Air Ride in 2003, Sakurai would resign from his position at HAL Laboratory, stating that he was tired of the constant pressure that came with releasing Kirby games, and having people naturally expect a sequel for every new game he developed ended up being exhausting. Now, while this was thought to be a major blow to the franchise, those worries were soon dismissed as Kirby would make his return the following year in Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. This entry took a significant detour from the usual shenanigans, as Kirby found himself in a Metroidvania-style game, in which all the levels were interconnected and possible to complete in any order. The game itself had players exploring worlds, solving puzzles, defeating enemies and bosses, but would also switch things up with the addition of its multiplayer aspects. The game had an in-game cell phone that when called could summon up to 3 other players. Additionally, this game would be the first to never feature King DDD. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and in this case, it was Kirby's run on the Game Boy Advance. Not to worry though, as barely a few months after the release of the Amazing Mirror, Nintendo would unveil their latest handheld console for Kirby to abuse, the Nintendo DS. Now I say abuse in a wholesome way, as between 2005 to 2011, Kirby would find himself a part of 4 new adventures for the system. As you'd expect with a DS, each game would make heavy use of its touch functionality. Kirby Canvas Curse, as the name implies, marks the level as the player's very own canvas, where they were able to draw lines, ramps, and walls to help Kirby complete each level. This was followed up by Kirby Squeak Squad, a return to the traditional platformer format, but would also include touch functionality with the ability to now store copy abilities in Kirby's stomach. Remember that Superstar game? Yeah, well that also got its own enhanced remake in the form of Kirby Superstar Ultra, which brought back all the game modes present in the original, as well as adding further game modes, multiplayer aspects, and even replacing the original cutscenes with pre-rendered ones in 3D. This game in particular, like its predecessor, was well received, and even went on to sell incredibly well, making it the best-selling Kirby game since the original Dreamland. The DSX Kirby collaboration would end with the release of Kirby Mass Attack in 2011, which I'm sure based on its name and its cover art, you could get a rough idea of what the game entailed. Now you may be asking at this point, like, wow, what about all the home console love? Didn't Kirby get any games on the home console? And rightly so, as 2007 saw the introduction of one of the most iconic game consoles ever invented. One that had anyone from your 5-year-old daughter to your 80-year-old grandpa flailing their arms while simultaneously beating your ass in boxing. Wait, that never happened to you guys? Now of course I'm talking about the Nintendo Wii. With such a popular and successful console, there was no way in hell the adorable little pink squisher wasn't going to make an appearance on it. Well, not only did he flourish on the Wii, but his first appearance on the console is still to this day the most critically acclaimed entry in the whole franchise. Now the game in question is none other than Kirby's Epic Yarn, released for the Wii in 2010. Developed by Good Field, the game may have branded the Kirby name, but its execution couldn't have been more different. The first thing many noticed was the game's new graphical style, in which the world and characters were made completely out of fabric. While more recognizable these days due to Good Field's future work on games such as Yoshi's Woolly and Crafted World, back in 2010, this artistic style was considered distinctly unique, and at least in my opinion, quite aesthetically pleasing. Well, just because the graphics were a bit different, the gameplay must have been similar, right? Well, again, this game would stray away from the norm as Kirby was unable to inhale or fly, instead relying on his ability to morph into other objects such as a parachute, car, and submarine. The game was so well received that it would go on to claim multiple awards, some even before the game officially released, like GameSpot's Game of the Show following its E3 2010 appearance. Kirby couldn't have asked for a better start on the Wii system, and it would certainly not be his last. But if you thought there was going to be a quick turnover in this case, then you'd be absolutely right, as in true Kirby fashion, fans would barely have to wait a year before another game would release, this time called Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Interestingly enough, this game was the result of a multitude of failed and cancelled Kirby games throughout the early 2000s, and despite its name, is completely separate from the other Dreamland games. The game would take on the traditional aspect of most Kirby games, and would feature the usual 2.5D side-scrolling platforming gameplay, now with 3D models for player characters and enemies. This game too would be received very positively, once again pushing Kirby towards his undeniable stardom. A few collections followed, but starting in 2014, Kirby would jump ships to another handheld console, this time the somewhat dated 3DS. Honestly, I'm surprised it took this long for a Kirby game to appear on the system, considering the 3DS came out all the way back in 2011. The deluxe games I'm referring to now were released in 2014. Kirby's Triple Deluxe would release in 2014 and would once again take on the 2.5D perspective. You may be wondering why it was called Triple Deluxe. Did it have 3 Kirbys? Was it a deluxe remaster of another game? Well, not really. The game, while having its main mode, also featured 2 sub-games in Kirby's Fighters, which was a Super Smash Bros. Style fighting game, as well as DDD's Drum Dash, which was a rhythm game that comically had King DDD jump on drums while avoiding enemies. These 2 sub-games would go on to get their own enhanced versions, which were downloadable via the 3DS eShop. Rest in peace. You will be missed. Kirby had been on every Nintendo console by this point, and he wasn't about to drop the ball this far into the journey. So while the Wii U wasn't a massive success, it still featured the small pink blob, albeit only once, in Kirby and the Rainbow Curse. The game was a spiritual successor to Canvas Curse and featured similar gameplay with players using the Wii U gamepad to help Kirby, who was stuck in ball form, move across the levels. After making his one and only appearance on the struggling console, Kirby would be back to the 3DS though, and his 11th mainline entry. Acting as a spiritual sequel to Triple Deluxe, the gameplay would follow along in a similar pattern, now allowing Kirby to move between multiple planes during stages. It too would have two of its minigames returned as enhanced versions in 2017. Kirby 3D Rumble in particular marked the first time a fully 3D environment was used, and now I'm not counting Kirby's Air Ride where you can get off and walk around for a little bit, because I feel like that's not really, it's not its own game, if that makes sense. But there was something else brewing during 2017, something that would define a shift in the focus of gaming as we knew it. By 2017, Battle Royales weren't a new genre, with H1Z1 and PUBG both finding incredible success. This success, however, would pale in comparison to the storm that was brewing in the distance. I don't think I have to explain what Fortnite did and the impact it had on the gaming landscape. And you may be asking why I'm even bringing it up in a Kirby video. Well, that's because Kirby must have been a fan of Fortnite, because he too would fall victim to the hype and feature in his very own game called Kirby Battle Royale. The game had 10 game modes, anything from the standard last person standing to the more abstract modes like War Express. The game too would play around with abilities within the 3D space, and by this point, people were certainly catching on and imagining the future of a 3D Kirby game. The game wasn't received well though, and goes to show that just slapping Battle Royale onto the title doesn't instantly make for a successful game. Now following this, you may think that the Kirby series wasn't looking too hot. The latest game not only sold poorly, but was also the lowest rated game in the entire franchise. During this period, however, Nintendo would unveil what has now become one of the most successful consoles ever, the Nintendo Switch. Kirby would start his adventures on the console in 2018 with the release of Kirby Star Allies. With his new companions, players could combine abilities with those of their allies to create new special attacks. The game also introduced the Dream Friend system, which allowed the player to call upon other characters like Bandana Waddle Dee, Meta Knight, and King Dedede, who all had their own unique and expanded movesets. The Switch effect would certainly take its effect, resulting in Star Allies selling just under 4 million units, a high point for the franchise as a whole. Over the next 2 years, Kirby would appear in a further 3 games, Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn, Super Kirby Clash, and Kirby Fighters 2. While all of these games were enjoyed by fans, none of them particularly stood out or sold incredibly well. Now by this point, the Kirby franchise had released over 30 games, the majority of which were enjoyed by many and sold decently well. It should be noted, however, that not a single game had been able to outsell the very first in the series. That was about to change, however, when Nintendo looked to take the franchise to the next level. While the franchise had incorporated 3D backgrounds and character models, and in some cases had experimented with 3D environments, the idea of a fully fledged 3D world still hadn't been realized. This was until 2020 when General Director Shinya Kumazaki teased that Kirby was about to enter a new phase, and that it would culminate the best aspects of Kirby. This renewed excitement in the franchise, and a year later, in August 2021, the official Kirby website would update its page with placeholder text hinting at the release of a new Kirby game. Luckily for fans, they wouldn't have to wait long, as just a month later, at the September Nintendo Direct, the latest entry would finally reveal itself to be Kirby and the Forgotten Land. This game truly was a new era for Kirby, being the first fully 3D platformer game in the whole franchise. Kirby would retain his usual arsenal of copy abilities, while gaining access to a few new ones called Drill and Ranger. Kirby would also be able to swallow much larger objects now, such as cars and vending machines, which to some extent reminds me of Epic Yarn. It should be no surprise to hear that it did extremely well, being praised for its graphics, level design, gameplay, and soundtrack. It would also be the first Kirby game to surpass Kirby's Dreamland in sales, totaling an impressive 6.46 million units as of the time of writing. The franchise would follow up with a further 2 games in Kirby's Dream Buffet, a multiplayer party game that plays control of ball-shaped Kirby as he rolls around fast food themed courses collecting strawberries, and most recently, Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe, which obliterated the competition during its launch window, selling well over 3 times that of Octopath Traveler 2. The Kirby franchise as a whole has resulted in 39 games, an anime, multiple comics, manga, and plenty of merchandise. And while it may not be the face of Nintendo like Mario, or have the sales of a Zelda, what Kirby and HAL Laboratory do have is the consistency and unwavering determination to create that are unmatched by any other franchise. Even 30 years after its inception, the adorable little pink blob is still breaking its own records, while ushering us into a new generation of his games. The franchise has managed to stay on top for over 30 years, and it's likely to continue well into the future. Who would have thought that a character, meant to be a simple placeholder all those years back, would end up becoming one of Nintendo's most beloved and surprising heroes?